for recovery. So yes, on October the 3rd, 1807, Jefferson was at the president's house and he received a strange cryptic note saying that there was a matter of momentous importance, two Arabic documents from the far west. So something that Jefferson might expect to receive from the Middle East comes from the Middle West or the far west at the beginning of the 19th century. And the book tells the story.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the deep dive series of Islam and the Idea of America. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by a prolific scholar whose discoveries in archives have brought remarkable and often forgotten stories to light. Professor Jeffrey Einboden. He is a distinguished research professor at Northern Illinois University, a former fellow of the National Endowment for the Humanities and the American Council of Learned Societies. Professor Einboden is the author of several important books, including Islam and Romanticism, The Islamic Lineage of American Literary Culture, the Qur'an and Kerygma, and most recently, Jefferson's Muslim Fugitives, the lost story of enslaved Africans, their Arabic letters, and an American president, published by Oxford University Press. Professor Einboden, I'm so delighted and excited to have you on the podcast. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Mustafa. It's a great honor. It really is.
So your book begins with a remarkable story and a remarkable scene in 1807, the final days of Jefferson's presidency. Two Arabic manuscripts written by enslaved fugitives, Muslim fugitives, made their way to Jefferson. Can you tell us what happened and why that moment matters?
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's a highly improbable story, and perhaps due to its improbability and other factors that I'm sure we'll discuss, this is why it's waited so long for recovery. So yes, on October the 3rd, 1807, Jefferson was at the president's house and he received a strange cryptic note saying that there was a matter of momentous importance that the traveler from Louisiana, which was far, far west during that time, had to speak to the president about. And as you say, in 1807, we're right into the second term of Jefferson. And the next day, he actually meets with this mysterious traveler and finds, as you say, that he is carrying two Arabic documents from the far west. So something that Jefferson might expect to receive from the Middle East comes from the Middle West or the far west at the beginning of the 19th century. And the book tells the story of how these improbable documents came to be, how they came to reach Jefferson, and how Jefferson instantly recognized their import, and how they, although seeming like the most obscure and unlikely, they intersect some of the most critical issues of the early republic and of Jefferson's career, of literacy and liberty, and of religion and race. And so it's the Jefferson's Muslim Fugitives book tells the story of those documents, those two Arabic slave documents that come from Western Kentucky and probably at the beginning of the 19th century, but also dilates out both 20 years before and 20 years after that moment in three interlocking stories of enslaved Muslims in the United States, including the very first enslaved Muslim writings that we have after the Revolution, all the way to onwards closer to the Civil War, and actually culminating in a moment at the Civil War in the 1860s, where Muslim slave writings are still echoing into the American scene. Jefferson tries very hard to get these documents translated. They provoke him. They imply so many of his diplomatic relationships going right back to his time in Paris, attempting to free Americans who were enslaved by Muslims in North Africa, echo on through his interest in Islam, through his presidency, but also have a long legacy as well. And yet he's never able to crack the code of the Arabic terms. And really, the pieces were not read until the book came out. But what's fascinating is that the way in which the Arabic written by these enslaved Muslims that reach Jefferson actually intersect, embody, invert in some ways his American career. And so we get the culmination of the Qur'an, including at the very end chapter, Surah An-Nas, Qul a'udhu bi rabbin nas, say, I take refuge in the Lord of all of mankind. This universal culmination of the Qur'an intersects the very heart of Jefferson's career, though he doesn't know it.
Very, very interesting indeed. One of the most moving parts of your book is its insistence, in one way or another, that enslaved Africans were not only laborers in the early America, but also writers, leaders, theologians, and multilingual intellectuals. Why has that been so difficult for American historical memory to recognize this?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. I mean, part of the reason, to zoom out is simply the loss of American historical memory regarding enslaved Muslims writing in Arabic whatsoever. And so this was a field that really began to be recovered in the 1970s, 1980s. But even since then, it has been difficult, I think, for the larger American historical community, both academic and more popular, to grapple with the fact that there were literate enslaved peoples in the United States bringing their own profound traditions of revelation and reason, logic, scholarship into enslaved situations. And part of this is simply the illegibility, right? So the writing in a different language, but also a sense of cultural illegibility as well. There's a lot of ironies associated with the Muslim slave materials that we have been able to recover. There's a subtlety, there's sophistication, there's a certain self-awareness by the Muslim authors who are writing in Arabic, knowing that it's very unlikely that they'll find a reader during their lifetime of the materials. Some do. The most famed, I guess we would say, enslaved Muslim in the United States, someone named Omar ibn Said, who lives right through almost to the end of the Civil War, enslaved in North Carolina, wrote an autobiography, but also received an Arabic Bible in which he wrote marginalia still at Davidson College, and had a kind of exegetical hermeneutic experience with Arabic biblical materials, even as he's writing still Quranic Arabic. And so he's bringing together Abrahamic faiths in his own exegetical, private way. And so we get someone doing a kind of comparative religious exercise beyond the great scholars, say, in the Ivy League during that time. In one of the documents that I was able to recover from Omar ibn Said, that's on the website at Northern Illinois University, just called Arabic Slave Writings in the American Canon, Omar ibn Said writes out a psalm about about the slave looking to the hand of the master. So this very on the nose, very specifically chosen psalm. But even within the same document, he also has, taslim on the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in the same document where he has a psalm, right? So he's merging together these different kind of charismatic or proclamatory traditions. And the other thing about Ibn Sayyid and so many of the Muslims enslaved who are writing is that they use the Qur'an as a kind of autobiographic substitute. So many of the writings that we have, I think, have been dismissed because they are, quote unquote, only the Qur'an or merely the Qur'an. Ibn Sayyid writes his own personal story, which also has very interesting religious contours. But so many of the other folks, and Ibn Sayyid too, reproduce the Qur'an, but they often choose very subtly incisive, sometimes ironic, sometimes cutting in their critique, selections from the Qur'an to express their own situation. And so Ibn Sayyid opens his autobiography in 1831 that he, pens in slavery and under coercive, highly unimaginable coercive conditions. And he begins with Surah Al-Mulk, which is the 67th chapter of the Qur'an, Tabarak alladhi biyadihi al-mulk, blessed be God in whose hand is the sovereignty or dominion, which has been recognized by many scholars as this fascinating way to begin the sense of transferring from the human to Allah, the idea of mulk, the idea of sovereignty. And then in the second ayah, he writes out the full surah before he begins his own autobiography, saying, I am Omar bin Sayyid. The next ayah speaks about, that life and death. God created life and death. لِيَبْلُوَكُمْ أَيُّكُمْ أَحْسَنُ عَمَلًا, to try you. And the second person speaking out to us, the reader, to try you, to test you, which one of you is best in action. And that's the opening to this enslaved Muslim's autobiography, right? It's not me, right? It's about you. Well, it's about all of us, right? But this idea of life as test, death also as test, and this kind of fortitude, sabr, patience, almost superhuman kind of patience in that situation to hold on to home commitments, faiths, religions, and writings.
Right. So I like to come back to the earliest, I think that was mentioned as the earliest Arabic writing in America, 1788 in Georgia as the earliest surviving example. What is that document, and why is it historically important? And I think you're out to light some of these materials for the first time ever, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, that's right. And this first appears, in print and to the modern scholarly notice in Jefferson's Muslim Fugitives. And as you say, Mustafa, it's the first document written by an enslaved man named Ursman. First document in Arabic written after the revolution. Now, we do have materials by a fascinating scholar named Job Ben Solomon in Maryland, writing before the revolution. So when, at that time, Maryland, still British America, right? Not the United States, but Ursman, who was enslaved just south of Savannah at a place called Parnassus Plantation, which is still there. Absolutely fascinating, on the Georgia seacoast where so many Muslims were enslaved. The Georgia seacoast, south of Savannah, full of these beautiful islands, which now many of them are nature preserves like Jekyll Island, or there's other islands like St. Simon's Islands. They really were an epicenter of enslavement for Muslims. And Islam really continued on after the Civil War there. There's traces still of people praying in the direction of Mecca and using some forms that remind one of Muslim Salat there on the islands. In any case, in Sapelo Island in particular. But this is where Ursman was enslaved. And he probably arrived, I think, from letters surrounding the event, probably around 1785. So we're speaking about only 2 years after the end of the revolution, the Treaty of Paris, 1783. And so he arrives almost immediately after U.S. time begins. Right? So the idea of national time.
Hey friends, this podcast is built from the heart, not from a budget. If it speaks to you, I'd ask one small thing. Please share it with a friend, with a classroom, with someone who's curious. That support means everything. Thank you.
And he penned a beautiful piece in 1788, a very extensive piece of Quranic recitation on the page. And then he penned another one in 1790, a kind of long scroll-like document that is a little bit more personal, traces some sacred lineages, including the angelic and the khulafa, the early leaders of Islam, and also signs it in his own name. And this is why we have his name, Ismuhu Ursman. His name is Ursman. And in that document, right before he signs his signature, he writes down the hawlaqa, the billah azim, and again, this sense of that everything is in the hand of providence, is in the hand of God, and this kind of submission not to human dominion, but instead to divine the idea of that it is all in the hand of Allah. And so, very profound documents, beautiful written documents. Those who witnessed him write out these Quranic and autobiographic Arabic documents in 1788 and 1790 remarked in this kind of with wonder about the speed and fluency of his writing, obviously highly trained as a scribe and scholar in the Senegambia before suffering horrific enslavement the Georgia seacoast, but also the person who witnessed the event and then eventually wrote about it, which is recovered for the first time in the Jefferson book as well, notes that it was like meeting a Greek muse. He says, as if you met Cleo or Urania, which are the kind of Greek muses of inspiration and history. And it's fascinating that actually in the documents themselves, as I said, we get a kind of reflection between the moment, perhaps unconsciously, in which the writing takes place and the American moment. So one of the uniquenesses about the 1788 document is it actually quotes in el insan la fi khusr, by time, verily, humanity is in loss, except for those who do pious deeds and advise each other in piety. But this sense of an awareness of time, the preciousness of time, when you think about enslavement, this kind of tedious and torturous captivity of time, still swearing by time. And this is happening right at the beginning of at the beginning of the U.S. These documents also are extremely significant because they are emblematic of something that happens with Muslim slave documents. And one of the reasons why so many of these have not been recovered, in addition to the fact that many early Americanists aren't reading Arabic, but in addition to that, they're also hidden within some of the most select archives of the highly educated. And so they have a kind of east-west procedure, coming from West Africa, from the east, from the mind of the Americans, coming westward to the Georgia seacoast, which is on the east coast of America. But they also have a north-south trajectory as well, and collected by a lot of Northerners who then send in the South, in places like Georgia, North Carolina, and then send these documents north for examination at the Ivy League. And Ersman's documents very much underwent both those kind of trajectories, coming westward, but then going northward from Georgia, sent north. And I eventually recovered both of his documents at the Massachusetts Historical Society in Boston. And so that's where his literary remains are. It's within relatively rather than the Georgia South.
Yeah, so I think you already answered a question came to my mind. I always think how much of this history remains hidden because of archives preserved Arabic texts without anyone being able to read them. But that's I think that's also not only about the ability, but also the interest. Someone, right, having an interest in American history, right, an American history, and knowing Arabic, the interest and ability, and also the geography that you mentioned. So that's I think makes I think your work even more precious, because this is how complicated that is.
Yeah, thank you, Mustafa. Yeah, I mean, one of the fascinating things, and again, irony, subtlety, inversion, that I was speaking about with Jefferson is in particular pertains to the Jefferson documents, but to the whole tradition of Muslim slave writings in general. And this is that they're often hidden in plain sight. So they're hidden in the most plain sight, in the most celebrated papers in early America. It's hard to imagine a archive from early America that hasn't been excavated and explored more than the papers of Thomas Jefferson. right? So it's been cataloged from
anything about Jefferson is a book, right?
any anything at all, right? There's books on Jefferson and food and animals and everything, and of course his contradictory and highly problematic legacies in so many areas, and including, of course, foremost enslavement, but also trivialities as well, almost everything, and then his personal papers too. Jefferson himself, was scrupulous, let's say, note taker and paper indexer of his own. And so he made many catalogs of his own material. He kept almost everything, made copies, facsimiles of so many things. And yet, in the most explored archive, these two documents stayed silent for all these years, right until the 21st century. And so it's really part of this is a kind of hiding in plain sight. It's a kind of a sense of just on the margin of focus. It's still within the field of vision. You just need to turn your head slightly and then be able to see it, right? To understand what you're seeing. And so a lot of the most public papers of the presidents, not only Jefferson, but presidents of universities, the president of Yale, who we'll talk about, I'm sure, he had Muslim slave materials from the early republic. A president of Harvard had Muslim slave materials in his material, in his archives as well. And so the most public people, especially from the North or in high places like Jefferson from Virginia, but then from the entire nation, held these materials in their keeping. It's interesting. Jefferson himself was an avid fan of ciphers, of secret writing, right, of finding a way to keep diplomatic correspondence hidden. And these documents themselves are the one hidden thing within his own papers that he could not crack the code of, that he could not turn into something that was patent and readable for himself. And they make, which is fascinating to me, Jefferson is associated as the great learned, early republic president. And yet these documents from enslaved Muslims make Jefferson illiterate, right? He can't read these, right? And yet he tries. He does try. But it's interesting that through the process of attempting to excavate these writings over the last almost 20 years or so, it's been interesting that, sometimes you come into an archive and there will be something just called the quote unquote Oriental box, right? Where they've put these invaluable treasures to someone like me just together, and through the last couple of centuries, right? So these documents, these kinds of documents have been around from the end of the 18th century. And so we're talking about more than 200 years of time, and small archives, large archives will accrue materials that they don't know what to make of. And they just put them in one, holding container. And so at the Boston Athenaeum, which is an absolutely beautiful place to work, they have some of the most beautiful treasures in Arabic, in Judeo-Arabic, in Persian. Not very much material, but extremely valuable in an intellectual sense material, but they're just all together. The archivists didn't know through the years how to sort them out because they didn't have an Arabist or someone who worked on Islamic languages. Sometimes, though, the idea has to do with the actual authors themselves. So one of the figures that the Jefferson book takes on in its last story, but he survives enslavement for 40 years. For almost a full 4 decades, from 1788 till around 1828. And he eventually comes into contact with some of the highest political figures, including the president at the time, at the end of the 1820s, which is John Quincy Adams, but also someone else I think we'll talk about a little bit later, who was a very prominent figure, Edward Everett. But in any case, he is writing Arabic slave documents in this fascinating way, and he actually gains his freedom because he's writing in Arabic. And this is
he was the prince, right?
Yes,
so that was the reason as to the president and so forth.
Right, and Terry Alford's book, I think in the late 70s, I think it might be 1977, was just called Prince Among Slaves, and this was about Ibrahim Abdul Rahman, and as a kind of fascinating story of release, but also great tragedy. Abdul Rahman never makes it home. So he's released. He's able to get his wife Isabella released, and eventually some of his children are also released. Many of his children, though, and grandchildren are kept in horrific bondage in Mississippi. He returns back to West Africa, but he dies in Liberia before being able to make it back to Futajalan. And in any case, it's that story that is told about him makes part in the 1970s and the early 1980s of this legacy of Muslim slave materials. But one of the things that Abdul Rahman does, he's traveling north after he's being released. A condition of his release is that he actually does have to leave the country, which he wants to in any case, but to leave the country. He's had North African aid from Morocco interceding on his behalf, even though he's not North African, he's West African. He makes his way up the East Coast and to try to raise money to get his family released from enslavement. And as he's going, folks are asking him to perform for them, basically, and to write out documents. And so one of the famous moments in 1828, he's in Philadelphia, and he's only, a little while before going back to West Africa. And somebody, his name Connie Reget, who was a charge d'affaires in the early U.S., asked him to write the Lord's Prayer, right? Because the other supposition is that all of these figures have converted to Christianity, right? And this is part of the reason why Umar ibn Sayyid was given that Arabic Bible that I mentioned. And so this idea that Abdul Rahman is actually now a Christian, so he's asked to write the Lord's Prayer in Arabic, right? And so he writes something out and gives it to this donor and this quote unquote important person, and probably receives a little bit of money for the fund to try to rescue his family. And then that document lays, unread for many years. And at the bottom is written, "This is the Lord's Prayer in Arabic." And you probably know where this is going. Instead of at the top of the document saying "Aban alladhi fis samawat," Lord, our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, in Arabic or something, it's the Fatiha, Rahim, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, Rahman, etc. So instead of the Lord's Prayer for the Christian, get the Lord's Prayer for the Muslim, right? And so is Abdul Rahman attempting to deceive the receiver of the document? Is he just hearing that this is my Lord's Prayer, right? But it's, the question regarding why do these remain hidden? Part of it is this idea of misattribution and deliberate subtlety, maybe subterfuge.
Yeah. So as a follow-up question about the archives, because you spent years in these archives, and
yeah.
Is there any moment that's shining to you? What was the most surprising moment for you?
Yeah, thank you.
In any episode.
Yeah, I rarely get that question, but this is obviously something that I think about all the time. And, as a kind of emotive, powerful emotive experience of finding these documents, I mean, the answer probably would be the most obvious, right? Finding these materials in Jefferson's papers, just because of the stunning surprise, the shock, that this exists. Had the sense that there was something like this from a report back in the 19th century in the Knickerbocker magazine, that Jefferson's papers held some Arabic documents looking like a spider had crawled across the page. Which is reported in the Jefferson, this strange Knickerbocker account that there's this something that can't be read. And so, of course, gets me excited. I'm looking for this, and I finally do find both documents at two different places, one in Washington, D.C. But finding that first document, extremely powerful, poignant shock. I thought, probably would never be able to find, but also the aptness, the shining through from history of a kind of commentary on the history itself. So the Jefferson book is about ideas of witnessing, of the problematics of viewing, something we've just been speaking about here, the idea of human obscurity and divine omniscience. And one of the quotations from that's in actually one of the documents that Jefferson receives is from Surah Al-Adiyat, وَإِنَّهُ عَلَى ذَلِكَ لَشَهِيدٌ, in the sense that God himself is witness over something. And in that case, it's human beings not being thankful for what we have. But the sense of the God himself as the ultimate shaheed, as the ultimate witness over all things. And this is something that Jefferson is carrying through his entire life and yet can't witness it himself. The actual content of the documents amplify their poignance and power, I think. Another moment that stays with me that I find haunting is very early in my career, spent some time in Austria because I was working on Islam and Romanticism and the idea of romantic Islam, and in particular, the translator of Hafiz, Muhammad Shamsuddin Hafiz, the great Persian poet, and whose name was Joseph von Hammer-Purgstall, Austrian Orientalist. In any case, I eventually had the opportunity to visit his dilapidated...
Your photos in your book, that these pictures
right
at the end of your book, Islam and Romanticism. Yes.
And going to that Schloss, which is, this estate, kind of a castle. For me as a Canadian, this is very far away from the kind of new world that, I grew up with. I went there in 2007, and the owner at that time, a wonderful woman, she allowed me and my wife to tour the castle and see so many of the things in it. The frontispiece of the castle, it's like a book as a frontispiece, but the entrance, Hammer-Purgstall writes out a Quranic quote from the chapter of Joseph. His name's Joseph, but some sort of Yusuf. Wallahu khayrun hafidan. God is the best of hafizes, the best hafiz, the best keeper, right? Of course, we have a lot of different uses for hafiz, someone who memorizes the Qur'an, or the poet, Muhammad Shamsuddin Hafiz, that Hammer-Purgstall himself loved to translate. But instead he put this quotation from the Qur'an above his entrance, and he's a Catholic romantic translator, and yet he holds the Qur'an as kind of intimately important to himself, his own religious life. His wife came from a Jewish background, converted to Catholicism, and then his grave has all of these different languages on them, bringing together kind of a world catalog of sacred language. And his own epitaph is written in Arabic, in highly Quranic Arabic. Inna lillah wa inna ilayhi raji'un. We're God's, and unto God we will return. This is how Joseph Hammer-Purgstall wanted to be remembered. In any case, very powerful in the sense of very haunting, and seeing the kind of intimate moments of both life and death of this man who kept close Quranic traditions, but yet came from a very different cultural and religious standpoint.
I'd like to come back to our earlier conversation about being hidden in plain sight, and these archives may be only accessible to a few elite. But I also get the sense in your book that that elite discussion among themselves were also important to think about the American freedoms. What does that mean? What does the construction of the idea of America in general, right? So can we say that, these manuscripts somehow also helped shape the debates around freedom, race, language, dignity, human dignity, as they were writers and intellectuals and producers, which was at that time in the Enlightenment era, something very much connected to the human dignity, I need to say.
Yeah, no, and I think that's a very good word. I mean, because this is what is so lacking, especially before the Civil War, and then, after the Civil War as well. The problematics of human dignity, and mentioned, Surat an-Nas, that Jefferson has, which, without knowing it, this, of humanity, right, rather than one bit of human history or community, but instead the idea of the entirety of humanity. This is something that is sent to him, though he can't read it. But it's interesting. I mean, it just ended off with the idea of Hammer-Purgstall's grave in Austria, but Jefferson's own grave in Monticello, near Charlottesville, Virginia. Gestures to what you're saying, I think, Mustafa, with this idea of the importance of Islam, the documents, but also just as a historical reality playing on the minds of American founders and founding documents, right? Debates about freedom in particular. So in Jefferson, if you go to Monticello and see Jefferson's grave, he puts three, and one is that he's the author of the Declaration, right, of American Independence, which we've just celebrated the 250th, right? But the other ones are not what we might think about, what I would have thought. He doesn't say, he's most proud of being an American president, the third president, or, the second vice president or anything like that. But instead, his other accomplishments are writing the Statute of Virginia for religious freedom. And the third accomplishment is that he founded UVA, he founded the University of Virginia. He's the father, actually, it says on the grave. And so why these are important, and think about Islam, is that the Statute of Virginia for religious freedom, Jefferson himself considers that statute as embracing what he says Jew and Gentile, Christian and Mohammedan, and putting those categories deliberately together, right? And so the sense that in some ways all of humanity is involved in Jefferson's mind within those categories. But the Muslim, the quote unquote Mohammedan, is very much part of creating a kind of universality of religious freedom, right from the beginning. And we're talking, before the First Amendment, right? And the First Amendment, the Constitution was not written by Jefferson, but was likely surely had debts to the statute for religious freedom with Jeffrey did pen and Patrick Henry. But so, even on his grave, and then he's the father of the UVA, the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. And one of the things that he does very near the end of his life, this is 1819 as the university is founded, one of the documents, one of the books that he says should be allotted to the university is the Qur'an. But he ensures that the Muslim scripture is part of the educational horizon for students at the University of Virginia. Another founding moment that's more controversial for the history of American freedom of religion, human dignity too, which is implied, is our treaty with Tripoli back in the late 1790s. And most treaties, from the early nation and another nation's not that interesting to most folks, which is understandable. But the treaty with Tripoli in 1796, it was then ratified in 1797. Has a famous phrase in its Article 11 saying that America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. And this has been debated by scholars, and it's even, makes its way to public press. And this was actually ratified, signed Adams, the first Adams, and ratified by the Congress. And this is in a treaty with Tripoli, with a Muslim nation. And for 200 years, thought that this Article 11 in the Treaty of Tripoli never really existed in the Arabic, but was made up by Joel Barlow, who was the one who translated and produced the English version. But one of the aha moments that isn't related to Muslim enslavement material, but came about through the Jefferson book, was I actually found the original for the original Arabic Treaty of Tripoli. And it does have an Article 11. Joel Barlow didn't just make it up out of nothing, but instead there's some basis to it. Now, it doesn't say that America is not in any sense founded upon the Christian religion, but it does have this sense of mutual dignity, respect between Muslims and American Christians at that time, and says that both of them shall be muhtaramin, that they're deserving of ihtiram, which has this sense of sanctity, of respect, of dignity, of inviolability, a mutual inviolability, but also, the root itself has a kind of sacred sense, a broad spectrum of meanings.
I'm glad you mentioned this because, yeah. I read these pages in your book, and this is a fascinating discovery. And you put the record straight, what was happening, what was the actual translation, what was, being then ratified and this and that. But this is a fascinating, I think, discoveries in your book, fascinating accomplishment.
Thank you. Yeah, the State Department version doesn't have an Article 11, right? And so this is why there's been the supposition that Barlow just simply makes this up, and to some degree he does, because it's a highly loose, with a lot of liberty translation or rewriting, let's say. But there is an Article 11. It gets worked into different ways into the treaty, but it's Barlow's own papers. He keeps the original of the Arabic from Tripoli in his own papers, which are at Harvard. And that's where I found it. So the sense of that Muslims and Americans of any confession or no confession deserve ihtiram from each other, right? The sense of sacred inviolability, which has a sense of dignity, but also kind of mutual respect in a slightly religious sense.
In the next part of our conversation with Professor Einboden, we delve into his earlier books. See you in the next episode.